The flagship aircraft carrier, Prince Charles, is being cannibalized for spare parts. It has never worked since the day that it was launched, breaking down in port, breaking down a second time in the Isle of Wight, within eyeline of the people who'd seen it, abortively launched in the first place. So wrecked is it that it is no longer functional. Well, sing hallelujah, because it will not be able to be sent by the so-called foreign minister of the so-called European Union into the Taiwan Straits in startling developments over the last 24 hours. The foreign minister, Borrell, has declared that China is our frontier, that Taiwan is not part of China, even though his own government, all the governments of the European Union, the British government, the United States government, and the United Nations consider it so to be. But it can't be if it is our frontier, and yet that is what he has encouraged European navies to sail in the Taiwan Straits. Now, I've said this before, some people don't like it. Some people in China don't like it. But if I was running China, I would sink these ships. These ships have no business in China's internal affairs. Taiwan is an integral part of China. What China does in Taiwan is as much its business alone as what the United States government does in Texas is its business alone. Actually, even more, because Texas was stolen by the United States off Mexico in the first place. I'm not even talking about a comparison with Taiwan or Puerto Rico. I'm talking about an integral part of the Chinese People's Republic. At least that is what all the governments of the world consider to be the case. And yet they ramp up and up and up the military and psychological pressure on China. And here's my guess: it will not end well for them, any better than it is ending well in the Ukraine. China will, I think, decide, perhaps has decided, that it is going to end this Taiwan problem before Taiwan gets any more pumped up with NATO weapons and is surrounded by more and more NATO naval assets. So it might just be a case of being careful what you wish for. I believe that China had no intention of taking back Taiwan into the motherland by force, but they may well be forced to do so if this continues. We'll see and keep it constantly under review. The war in Ukraine is going from bad to worse. The spring offensive that later became the summer offensive may now have been postponed until the autumn. The truth is, despite all the huffing and puffing of NATO capitals and the chancelleries of Europe and North America, Ukraine is not in any position to take significant land back from the Russian forces that are now there in overwhelming numbers. And neither would the people of the territories now returned to the Russian motherland be prepared to accept it. That doesn't stop some of the stray dogs, like the government of the United Kingdom, constantly hyping for more. But Zelensky now, to me, looks a tired and beaten man, already on the deck chair on the beach of his next port of call, which may be Florida, may be Tel Aviv, may be both of them. But the war drags on, and the poor people of Ukraine are being sacrificed in what Robert Kennedy Jr. said this week was a proxy war. Kennedy is off and running with his presidential bid, and he's made a terrific start. He demanded the release of Julian Assange and the dropping of all the charges against him. He declared that the Ukraine war, in which his own grandson was a mercenary on the Ukrainian side, to be that proxy war, and vowed that if president, he would end United States involvement in the war. All very important when you consider the big issues that we are going to consider tonight. I make no apology for the fact that tonight is more or less all about America, more or less all about the CIA, and here is why. The world changed at 9/11. No one could seriously doubt that. Everything that we are now facing, we are facing as a result of 9/11, of the subsequent invasions of Iraq and of Afghanistan, the disastrous occupations of both those countries, the desire to put in power in Libya and then in Syria the very people who carried out the atrocity on 9/11 is something that historians will surely puzzle to explain to future generations. But if everything changed after 9/11 for everybody, then everybody has an interest in knowing exactly what happened on 9/11. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And who made it happen? This week, in journalism that would win a dozen Pulitzer Prizes, The Grey Zone, and Kit Clarenberg, the investigative journalist, a countryman of mine, broke the news from court depositions in the United States that two of the hijackers on 9/11 were people working with the CIA. The word agents we'll explore, but they were in contact with and they were dealing with the CIA in the months and weeks and days and hours prior to the hijacking of those airplanes and the catastrophe that happened in New York, in Washington, and almost elsewhere on 9/11/2001. If true, it is the biggest story ever. Think about that. If it is true that this disaster occurred not only because of the inability of the FBI and the CIA to engage in joined-up writing, not only did it happen because of an insane rivalry between these two institutions, fundamental to the American Republic, but that one of those two institutions was running two of the people who boarded the aircraft and took control of them and flew them into the Twin Towers. That is the biggest story ever, isn't it? Because if true, it means potentially that this entire thing, either wittingly or unwittingly, was to an extent at least an inside job which would change the perceptions of everybody in the United States if only they were allowed to read it, if only they were allowed to see it. Well, on the mother of all talk shows, even if nowhere else, they will be able to hear and see from the author of the piece himself. The other CIA story is, if anything, more vitally, urgently, and contemporaneously important. I have hated the CIA all of my adult life. I first came into contact with them personally when a man called Philip Agee ran for the rectorship at the university in the town where I lived and worked. He was, according to the whistleblower. My then party colleague, Brian Wilson, who was himself a former rector of the university, I think, he brought Philip Agee to Dundee and ran a spirited rectorial candidate, sure. And I got to know a lot from Philip Agee about the inner workings of the Central Intelligence Agency. I then watched them in the many crimes that they have committed since I was 18 years old at the time. The CIA have committed crimes all over the world, but it is relatively new, at least from the second half of the 20th century, that they began committing them on a significant scale in the United States itself. The CIA was the organization that President John F. Kennedy promised to shatter into pieces and scatter, just before they shattered his head into pieces and scattered his brain on November 22, 1963, which is the date, I believe, that the American Republic died. Kennedy's anger was caused by the emergence of the obvious truth that they had been lying to him about the Bay of Pigs fiasco, when mercenaries coordinated, paid for, and militarily assisted by the United States of America invaded and tried to occupy Cuba, were roundly defeated by the Cuban people and President Kennedy gravely embarrassed. The CIA killed John F. Kennedy, in my view. I believe they also killed Martin Luther King. I believe they also killed Malcolm X. I believe they also killed Robert Kennedy Sr. on his way, surely, to becoming President of the United States. That's a lot of very high crimes indeed in just one decade in the 1960s. And they didn't stop lying, cheating, stealing, and killing, and rigging ever since. Now this week, a mild-mannered man called Morrill, not to be confused with the rabid dog Borrell, who is the Foreign Affairs chief at the European Union, revealed under testimony to the Security and Intelligence Committee of the US Congress that he had been tasked by Antony Blinken, now the Secretary of State of the United States of America, but then merely a head functionary of Joe Biden's presidential campaign, to spin the lie and organize a conspiracy to spin the lie that Hunter Biden's laptop was an act of Russian disinformation, knowing that to be untrue. In fact, everyone involved, including the FBI, knew that that was untrue from the beginning. And thus, a conspiracy to deceive the American public through the American media, legacy media, as well as the so-called alternative media, social media, because Twitter was up to its eyeballs at that time in this conspiracy. The Morrill CIA, he was then acting director of the agency. The Morrill CIA set about their job with gusto. They rounded up no less than 51 senior, many of them famous, 3 of them former directors general of the CIA, to go on the front page of every newspaper and every single news bulletin on every channel in the United States of America, to say that the Hunter laptop story was a piece of Russian disinformation and should be entirely disregarded. In fact, the New York Post, which broke the story in the first place, had its Twitter account taken down for persisting that its story was true. Many people had their accounts blocked on Twitter and on Facebook for insisting that this story was true. And in fact, it became impossible in the closing weeks of a presidential campaign to talk about, on mainstream media or on social media, a story of such grave importance that it cannot but have influenced the outcome of the presidential race in 2020. Because what was in Hunter Biden's laptop was not just utterly devastating in public relation terms about the crack-smoking, whore-using son of the putative president of the United States of America, but many more damning things than that. Many more damning things than that, including, but not excluding many others, the existence of a big guy, Mr. 10%, who had to get his beak into 10% of everything that was being earned were in Ukraine. The corrupt business enterprise of Hunter Biden in Ukraine had a Mr. Big. That Mr. Big may or may not have been Joe Biden, though it's difficult to see who else it could have been, because it transpires that Hunter Biden's business partner in Ukraine made dozens of visits to the vice president's office in the White House when Joe Biden was vice president and with plenipotentiary powers in the Ukraine. So if Joe Biden were to be revealed in this laptop story to have been on the take in Ukraine, to have been Mr. Big, the big guy in the Ukraine, if he were to have been revealed to have been corruptly, secretly, undeclared, receiving vast subventions of money from an Eastern European country, wouldn't that put a different coat of paint on subsequent events between the United States and Ukraine? But that never had the chance to happen. Mueller was very honest. He told the committee that he had received the orders from Blinken and he had carried them out to the best of his ability because, and I quote him, "I wanted Vice President Biden to win the election." This is the acting Director General of the Central Intelligence Agency, engaging in a criminal conspiracy because he wanted Vice President Biden to win the presidential election. Thus, this week, it can be safely concluded that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Maybe, brackets, maybe, not in the way that Donald Trump alleged, but that it was stolen is now clear beyond any reasonable contradiction. It was stolen by interference in the American electoral process, not by Russian intelligence, but by American intelligence. We'll be talking to the one and only Chris Hedges about that and much more. Get your seatbelts on. Told you it was going to be a bumpy ride. This is the mother of all talk shows.